Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, African demonstrations in support of the Palestinians caught in the middle of the Middle East conflicts continues. In South Africa, though, the Jewish community there says that many are shocked at the reported lack of local compassion over the mass killings in Israel that triggered the latest escalation around Gaza. And over 6 months of war in Sudan have sent over 1 million refugees over the borders looking for safety. Our team reports from Chad, where aid organisations are struggling to keep up with the scale of the crisis. And the historical and cultural ties of the African diaspora are at the heart of a Lagos festival. The fourth door of return invites those of African descent from all around the world to walk back down the paths of their history. But first, at least 50 people were reportedly killed in a single hour in the Palestinian Gaza Strip on Tuesday as Israel ramped up its retaliatory bombings there. Now, that's over the murder of around 1,400 people in Israel by gunmen from the militant group Hamas earlier this month. However, since then, a wave of demonstrations have sprung up in parts of Africa in support of the Palestinian civilians currently under siege in Gaza. Now, in South Africa this week, leaders of the South African opposition EFF party held a rally outside of the Israeli embassy condemning the country's policies towards Palestinians. And throughout South Africa, divisions over the Middle Eastern conflict run deep.
Free, free Palestine! Free, free.
Officially, Pretoria is not taking sides over the Israel-Hamas conflict, but as pro-Palestinian demonstrations multiply in South Africa, some recognizable political voices have made their allegiance clear.
The apartheid state of Israel's embassy is no longer welcomed in South Africa.
That we stand side by side with Hamas, with the Palestinian resistance, and we will fight side by side with them to ensure that they too realize their liberation in their lifetime.
1,400 people, including 2 South Africans, were killed in the October 7th attack on Israel by Palestinian extremist group Hamas. Since then, over 5,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed in Israel's siege and bombing of Gaza. Pretoria referred to the ongoing oppression of the Palestinian people, even as it condemned Hamas' assault. South Africa's Jewish community, still hoping for the return of those kidnapped by Hamas, say they feel betrayed by the ruling ANC party.
And we tried to engage with the government, and we received no response. There was absolutely no compassion shown to us or shown to the victims. So what we had to do was we had to take a 4-page advert, "Dear Mr. President," in the media, in the Sunday Times, and only then did we hear a condemnation from our president.
South Africa has recently offered to mediate amidst the escalation of the Middle Eastern war, but past attempts to use the South African experience of ending white minority rule to help with conflict negotiations haven't worked. Some specialists say different reconciliation models are needed.
The Palestinian campaign is for national independence and separation from Israel, while the Black South African campaign was about integration with equality in the shared political frameworks of South Africa. So the internal focus of the South African struggle and the external focus of the Palestinian struggle are obviously different. So the same approaches that worked in South Africa may not work in other contexts.
As the deadly war in Israel and Gaza continues, South Africa has upheld calls for an end to violence on both sides.
Now, there's been shock in eastern DR Congo over the killing in Beni of 26 people in an attack that's been blamed on the ADF militia group. Now, it's been terrorizing communities in the region since the 90s, and many of the latest alleged victims are reportedly children. Our correspondent brings us more from DR Congo.
Witnesses say that armed men raided homes in one part of Arusha on Monday night. Several victims of the violence died of knife wounds. The authorities have blamed the killing on the ADF, a Ugandan armed group accused of killing thousands of civilians. The militia has pledged allegiance to Islamic State. It's been 2 years since the DRC and Uganda launched a joint military operation to try to stop the ADF's attacks. Several terrorists have since been neutralized, but the military offensive hasn't reduced the level of violence against civilians.
Early there for us in Kinshasa. Now, Liberia's President George Weah will face off against his challenger Joseph Boakai for a second time, this time on November 14th. Election officials from Liberia have announced a runoff vote after neither candidate managed to win an absolute majority in this month's presidential election. Weah won about 43.83% of the ballots and Boakai 43.44% on October 10th. And the US is suspending most of its financial assistance to Gabon after having formally designated the ousting of President Ali Bongo a coup. Foreign aid had already been put on hold since September 26th. Now, the Gabonese army seized power on August 30th, minutes after results were delivered from an election that would have returned Ali Bongo as leader. Now, those were quickly annulled, and the junta has since promised to bring in democratic elections, but has not yet shared a timetable for that. More than 1 million people have fled Sudan since war broke out there in mid-April. Most of them are heading to neighbouring Chad, which has already taken in around 423,000 refugees. That means on the ground, aid agencies are struggling to keep up. Our correspondent, Bastien Renouy, sent us this report from the town of Adre, which is where most of the refugees arrive.
Adults devastated by war and children undernourished. Doctors Without Borders is busy treating patients in the Adre refugee camp.
He came in with a high temperature, so we tested him for malaria, and he was positive. At the moment, we get around 300 people a day, and we need more medical staff to be able to offer proper consultations to such a large number of patients.
The small emergency clinic is incapable of treating the camp's 150,000 Sudanese refugees. MSF has decided to expand it, but like many NGOs, they're struggling to get enough funding.
The current crisis is not being talked about enough. It's flying under the radar. You don't hear about what's going on when you're in Europe or the West, and as a result, the region is receiving very little funding. And yet, it's one of the major crises, perhaps the biggest crisis in the world today.
All aid workers and refugees in Adre agree. More money is needed. It's been months, and people living here are still sleeping on the ground in makeshift shelters, and food distributions are all too rare.
We're not being given enough aid. Some families made up of 10 to 15 people only receive 2 sacks of sorghum a month. It's just not enough.
No one had anticipated such a large and fast influx of refugees. Chad has opened its borders to civilians, but authorities fear they won't be able to cope.
The humanitarian crisis in eastern Chad is something that even the government can't cope with. We need the international community to work with our partners so that we can expand our resources.
According to the UN, more than $1 billion are needed to help Sudanese refugees in neighbouring countries. To date, only 20% of that sum has been raised.
Well, Lagos has recently wrapped up the 4th edition of the Door of Return Festival, an annual event where people of African descent from around the world are welcomed to the Nigerian city and are given a chance for the diaspora to celebrate their historical and cultural connections to the continent.
This would have been the last thing that their ancestors saw centuries ago. Thousands of African slaves being shipped from this port of Lagos to a life of forced labor in America and to the Caribbean, feeding the growth of colonial empires. 400 years later, some of their descendants have chosen to return to experience the same painful journey, including a walk along the 1.5-kilometer slave route to the ocean, an arduous walk that African slaves in chains faced as they marched to waiting merchant ships.
Well, it was a hard, tiring experience. Fortunately, we weren't in chains like our ancestors were, but we were reminiscing.
We are, from 3 races, so I want to understand where the African piece of our ancestors went through and all of their experiences. So this is very significant. I'll be able to bring really good real facts to my family and to my friends who were.
Guests were shown relics from centuries ago, including the attenuation well where slaves were forced to drink. The festival is an attempt to reconnect the African diaspora with the homeland.
It's a symbolic connection, economic, spiritual, emotional, physical. And as they are coming, as they say, conversation breeds comprehension.
Badagry in Lagos State was a major slave port during the transatlantic slave trade. Up to 28 million Africans are believed to have been shipped across the Atlantic between the 5th and 19th centuries.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks very much for joining us, though. Do so again if you can. Till then, take care.